Ronald Harden, speaking from Dundee. Very many thanks for inviting me to contribute to this important conference. I'm only sorry that I'm not able to be with you in person, but here we are speaking at a distance with technology. So thank you again for the invitation. The theme I wanted to address is the changing role of the medical student. These are exciting times in medical education. Many of the developments in medical education were highlighted at the AME conference last year. It was a virtual conference. Here's some of the developments. Some of the exciting developments in medical education. Many of these related to the curriculum, others to the teacher, but also very much on the agenda was the role of the student, the role of the student. And in these exciting developments we're talking about in medical education, the student has an increasingly important role. These are exciting times, as suggested in the Times Higher Education. The future is still downloading. The future is still downloading, but it will certainly involve the student. And in another issue of Times Higher Education, it commented on that in the coronavirus crisis is a chance to radically remake higher education, a chance to radically remake higher education. And that, I want to argue, includes a consideration of the role of the student in these exciting developments in medical education. In the past, we've seen the student almost as a customer or as a client. But I think the move is to think about the student much more as a partner in the learning process. Students are a partner working with us in creating and implementing the curriculum. This was highlighted by Sharon Kapadia in an article in Medical Teacher. She said, students as partners, this might raise some eyebrows. After all, aren't teachers there to teach and students there to learn? Aren't teachers there to teach and students there to learn? But she went on to say that, look, what they have done in her medical school as a result of the coronavirus changes, they've produced outputs that led to a significant change in the curriculum in the short space of 2 weeks. The students working with the staff had changed the curriculum in 2 weeks. Students as partners. And this notion of co-creating learning and teaching, students as partners with staff, was highlighted in this book by Catherine Boville, Co-Creating Learning and Teaching, probably the classic book on this topic. So student engagement in the curriculum is very much on today's agenda. And there are a number of reasons, a number of catalysts for this greater student participation that we need to think about in our own institution. There's the more general notion of consumerism. We're living in a society where the consumer is more important, where there's greater stakeholder involvement. All the stakeholders are much more involved in patient care. The patient as the stakeholder is much more involved in planning their own treatment and working with medical staff and other healthcare professionals. So greater stakeholder involvement. There's a move in education to much more student-centered education. I described a number of years ago the SPICES model. And the S is the move from teacher-centered to student-centered education. Teacher-centered to student-centered education. There's also increased student interest in education. Students want to get much more involved in the education program. This is a graph that shows the number of students who were a co-author of papers published in Medical Teacher. And way back in 2000, it was only about 2% of papers as students a co-author. By 2010, this had risen dramatically to over 9%. But note, by 2017, about 14% of papers had students as a co-author. So greater student interest in medical education. And our ESME courses, our Amy ESME courses, have a special ESME course for students, which attracts great interest each year of students. So students are increasingly interested in participating in the education program. There's also significant technology developments that also have facilitated students' involvement. There's a general increase in social responsibility in healthcare profession education. For example, in relation to sustainability and climate change. In the Aspire to Excellence program, where we recognize and aim at excellence in medical education, one of the areas recognized for excellence is social accountability. Social accountability. And students are increasingly involved in this move to more social accountable curricula. Indeed, one of the other areas in the Aspire program is student engagement that recognizes excellence in a medical school in student engagement. Student engagement is recognized where students get engaged with the management of the medical school, the provision of the education program, and more generally with the academic community. And these are spelled out in more detail in the information about the Aspire program. And finally, a catalyst for this move to greater student participation is the evidence that it actually works. This isn't just some science fiction or some ideal that's unobtainable. Greater student participation has major benefits. The benefits are, firstly, there's greater academic achievement. Students actually do better, achieve better if they're involved. And secondly, that they develop other skills that they would perhaps not normally engage with: creativity, critical thinking, innovating, and negotiating. So the benefits of student engagement are now well documented and evidence-based. So the changing role of the medical student is a theme of this presentation. So what is the implication if we want to have students more engaged, students more participating? What is the implication for the changing role of the student? And I want to suggest to you in this presentation, there are 7 roles of the student we need to think about. 7 roles of the student we need to think about: information processor, curriculum collaborator, assessor, teacher, scholar, professional, and facilitator of learning. And I want to look with you briefly at each of these 7 roles of the student. And these are changing roles. We've described in another book with Pat Willey, the 8 roles of the teacher, where we looked at the roles of the teacher. And in this new book, which is being published later this year by Elsevier, with my daughter Jenny Harden, I look at the changing role of the student. And we describe these 7 roles of the student. So let's look at each of these roles briefly in turn. Firstly, there's the student as a facilitator of their own learning. The student has a major responsibility to facilitate their own learning. And this is all tied up with this notion of self-regulation theory, as described in the Amy Guide 58, where students take control of their own learning. So this is very much a role that's on today's agenda. Students should be taking much more control of their own learning. And this is described in the Amy Guide 58. Here's two of our students doing just that at Dundee, where they're working together as a pair, working through a cardiovascular system program online. And they have different choices they're making. They decide whether they want to work individually or in pairs, whether they want to use self-assessment at the beginning or at the end of the program, whether they read the text or listen to the audio, and they decide when they want to study and for how long, and the depth of what to study. So much more personalized learning where students are taking control and facilitating their own learning. There's been a big move over the last 2 decades to outcome-based education, as described in this AME guide. And this specification of the competencies or outcomes expected, of course, helps the student to take control of their own learning. If they know where they're trying to go, what they're trying to achieve, then they can decide how best to get there. This move to outcome or competency-based learning, where students know what they should learn, and they can be accepting a responsibility for achieving that objective. Another tool that's helpful for the student in facilitating their own learning is a curriculum map. And curriculum mapping is described in AME Guide number 21, a curriculum map, which helps the student to manage their own learning, to facilitate their learning. If we give the student a curriculum map, they can do this. If you're coming to the UK for a number of years, you would be helped by a map of where you might want to visit in the UK. Well, maybe not England, but certainly Scotland, where you'd want to visit Dundee, Aberdeen, Inverness, Glasgow, or Edinburgh. And the map would show you how to get to these different destinations and the ways of getting there. A curriculum map, in the same way, does this for the curriculum. So facilitating their own learning. The second role is processing information. The student has a major job now as an information processor. This is particularly true with the problem of information overload. Huge increase in the information that students have to manage. And we need to help students. What is the most effective approach to processing information? Some of the methods they've used in the past, for example, rereading a paragraph or highlighting or underlining, we know are not the most effective ways of processing information. So we've learned a lot from educational psychology. We need to help our students to think about how can they most effectively process the information we present them with. This matters in this article, Fostering the Development of a Master Adaptive Learner. It talks about our responsibility to help students by providing future physicians with strategies for learning in the healthcare environment and for managing change more effectively. We give them strategies for learning. So we help our students to manage their own learning, to process information, but how can they do this more effectively as a student? So students are facilitator of their own learning, how to help them process information. And thirdly, the role as a curriculum collaborator, Students as curriculum collaborators involves almost every school now has students in some way or another helping to evaluate the curriculum, filling in forums, reviews of their understanding of the curriculum and their evaluation of the curriculum. But also, many schools now have students on the curriculum committees, members of curriculum committees. But thirdly, co-producers, students, not just in influencing the curriculum, but helping actually to produce the new curriculum, as in that article I referred to earlier. In this particular article, it talks about student participation in the development of interprofessional education courses. So it looked at how can students contribute to work with staff as partners in the development of interprofessional education courses. And the conclusion was that students contributed to both the process and the results of the course development in a complementary manner. Students work complementary to the staff in developing the interprofessional courses. So students as co-collaborators in the development of courses. Now, there's a lot of benefits to be gained, and these have been evidence-based benefits, that Student engagement and empowerment in the curriculum overall is encouraged if you help students to co-create courses. There's an improved understanding of the course aims if students are partners in helping develop the course, what the course's aims and objectives are. The courses tend to be more authentic and more meaningful if co-created by students and staff. Improve quality of the courses. And students working in co-creating courses develop skills, including assertiveness, negotiation, communication, critical thinking, and team working. Students develop additional skills if working with staff in the co-creation of courses. And the staff too is part of their development, working with the students. Faculty develop their own skills in teaching and curriculum development. And finally, involving students as partners in the development of the curriculum nurtures a creativity and a pedagogical flexibility, more likely to move to, for example, flipped classrooms and other new developments if students are working in partnership. More creativity and pedagogical flexibility. So these are just some of the benefits that have been proven and shown to occur if we involve students in co-creation of courses. And these were highlighted again in Catherine Bovill's book, Co-Creating Learning and Teaching. Students as an assessor, I wanted to highlight first the notion of self-assessment, students assessing their own competence. It's something we tend to ignore or we feel students are bad at, but we shouldn't ignore it or neglect it. Students as self-assessors should be an important learning outcome. There's an interesting quote in this book, If Mind Matters. We must constantly remind ourselves that the ultimate purpose of evaluation is to have students become self-evaluating. If students graduate from our school still dependent upon others to tell them when they're adequate, good or excellent, then we've missed the whole point of what education is about. In other words, when students leave us, we won't be there to evaluate the students. As practicing healthcare professionals, they've got to evaluate their own competence, and we've got to help students develop the skills of self-assessment. It's important. Here's a couple sitting on a small island. At least they think it's a small island, they're having a picnic, but they've really not assessed the situation adequately. And what we need to help students in all they're doing, assess their own skills and competence and where they are. So self-assessment is a key role for the student. But so also is peer assessment. And it's been suggested that one way of developing the skills of self-assessment is start off by peer assessment, collaborating in the assessment of their colleagues. And I think there's a very important role in assessment of students contributing, because students understand things about their colleagues that as teachers we may not easy to measure. For example, attitudes. This is the picture of Harold Shipman. You probably heard of the tragic case in the UK. Hopefully it can't happen now, but a number of years ago, he was a general practitioner and he was responsible for the death of more than 300 patients. Yes, responsible for the death of more than 300 patients. And he just practiced medicine quite inappropriately. It was his attitudes to patients that was the problem. And it was interesting. I knew someone who was in the same year at medical school as Harold Shipman, and said, we knew then there was a problem. You know, he'd never have been qualified. We'd never want to have him treat us or responsible for our parents or our children. He had completely the wrong attitude to practice. But he did very well in all the written exams and clinical exams and passed high up the rankings. But he didn't have the right attitudes. And sometimes it's the students who are better able to assess their peers' attitudes than we are as staff. So we should really think about involving students as peer assessors. in this article, Medical Teacher, Can and colleagues reported that peer assessment, students assessing their peers, promotes learning both for the assessors and the assessed. That the students being assessed learned, and the students who were doing the assessment learned as well. So peer assessment really is very much on today's agenda in medical education. It has difficulties and problems, but these can be overcome. And then we have the student as a teacher. Student as a teacher. In this AMY guide, it talks about peer-assisted learning, not just peer-assisted assessment, but peer-assisted learning. It gives a planning and implementation framework. It talks about the associated cognitive, pedagogical, attitudinal, social, and economic benefits, the many benefits to be gained by students teaching each other's about the curriculum. Students teaching about the curriculum. This is two of my grandchildren. Rory was working on the computer here. He's quite young at this stage. And how did Rory learn to use the computer? He didn't go to a course in computing. He didn't read a book in computing. I didn't certainly teach him. I didn't know too much at that stage either. How he learned was Cara, his sister, taught him how to use the computer, peer-assisted learning, a powerful learning tool. So the role of the student as a teacher, increasingly important. And then we have the role of the teacher, of the student as a scholar, where they're reflecting on the education program. What are the benefits and problems with the education program? And they look at it in the light of other evidence about what is effective. For example, the BME, Best Evidence Medical Education systematic reviews. They think about how do these apply to their own curriculum. For example, the use of simulation. As a scholar, they should be also engaging in research. It can be research about the curriculum. They can be innovating and introducing new approaches, and increasingly students are active as partners in innovating and introducing new approaches in the curriculum. And they should be communicating their experience. In the literature, as I've shown, or at meetings at the AMY conference, I'm always impressed by the presentations made by students. This year's AMY conference is back to a face-to-face conference and also online in Lyon in August, and some very impressive abstracts submitted by students computing their experience on designing and developing and evaluating curricula. So all ways that students can demonstrate their scholarship in education, reflecting on what's happening, applying evidence-based evidence to it, engaging in research and education, introducing new approaches, and communicating it at meetings and in writing. And finally, with the student's role as a professional, a role of professional, student's professionalism. Perhaps the key role to think about initially is the student is a student doctor, and I've got to demonstrate their role as a professional, as a student doctor, and what's expected of professionalism in medical education, very much on the agenda. But they've also got to demonstrate professionalism as a learner. What's expected of them as a learner? What's their commitment? If staff have a commitment to teach, one of the features of outcome-based education, students also have a commitment to learn, to meet these learning outcomes. So a professional as a learner. I've added also professionalism in terms of their own personal well-being. Again, increasingly on the agenda, their professional well-being. And then I've added civic professionalism, students' professionalism in relation to what's happening in society around them, whether it's about climate change or gun violence or whatever. There's civic professionalism. So different elements of professionalism. So in this meeting, I've tried to suggest that there's a changing role for the medical student, a changing role for the medical student. I've suggested that the student is more than a customer or consumer, and should really be a partner in our learning program. The students should be empowered individuals who are given responsibility for learning and aspects of decision-making in the education program. They're partners with us in learning and decision-making. In the International Journal of Students as Partners, it noted that teachers and students work in partnership to enhance learning and teaching in higher education is a shared responsibility. It's a shared responsibility working with students. Indeed, we hear a lot in medicine now about threshold concepts. Provocatively, I want to suggest to you that a threshold concept for medical education, one that we need before we can think further about the subject, is the notion of students as a partner. It's a threshold concept for us to think about before we progress in our thinking about medical education.
Why do I stand up here? Anybody?
To feel taller.
No. Thank you for playing, Mr. Dalton. I stand upon my desk to remind myself that we must constantly look at things in a different way. See, the world looks very different from up here. You don't believe me? Come see for yourselves. Come on. Come on. Just when you think you know something, you have to look at it in another way. Even though it may seem silly or wrong, you must try.
You must look at things in a different way, and that's my suggestion in this presentation. We need to look at medical education in a different way and look at the changing role of the student. I've argued that it's the most important development in education, not just in the past 2 decades, but I'd argue in the next 2 decades. This is an important issue. We need to look at education in a different way. The students are not just there as consumers or clients, but they're there as partners and the changing role of the student. And I've suggested these different ways that the student may implement their engagement in the curriculum. Thank you very much again for inviting me, and I'd be very pleased to have your own comments on your perceptions of the student role and to ask any question, answer any questions. So thank you again for the invitation.